Already? Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I'm Peter Van Valkenburgh. I'm from Coin Center, which is a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., which I'll explain in a second. So this is the end of a week-long symposium. Seems like the right thing to do is to bring a lawyer up on stage. It'll definitely be a change of pace from what I understand from the schedule. Hopefully it'll be a refreshing change of pace for you all. But what I'm going to talk about is my area of expertise, which is cryptocurrency policy and regulation. So just as a roadmap for this session and the next hour-long session, I'm going to talk about three primary topics. The first thing I'm going to do, and it'll definitely be just the first probably half of this first hour, is what we call the moral ethical policy arguments in favor of cryptocurrency. Because those often don't get made in a fully cogent way other than like, man, fuck the government or something like that, you know? The second thing I want to talk about is the existing regulations that already apply to a lot of activities that people perform or do using cryptocurrency. And I also need to talk about permissioned versus permissionless cryptocurrencies or digital currencies because that influences how regulations generally might apply, and because of certain current events that have happened recently in the cryptocurrency space. And then the last thing I'll talk about, and this will definitely be in the second session after the break, is some constitutional law of cryptocurrency, which is in many ways more academic because constitutional questions are sort of far, they're not near. They don't always have immediate impact, but they could have very immediate impact if certain regulatory evolutions ever came to a point where we had to make First Amendment arguments why a regulation is somehow not permissible, or Fourth Amendment arguments why certain data collection violates our rights to not have warrantless search of our private information. Cool. So the first topic, that sort of moral ethical case, is I'm going to go over it. It comes from a report that we released last February where we make the case for electronic cash, why these things should be viewed as socially important. So if that's interesting to you, feel free to find the full report. And the third topic, the final topic, is also from a report that I published. The last one was our executive director on the constitutional law issues. So, and these slides will come back later, but I just wanted to give you a heads up that there are pretty fully thought out, well-researched and cited research papers behind the first and the third topics. And the second topic, which was the sort of existing regulations and how they apply, it's sort of just what I do day to day for the last 5 years of my life as a lawyer. And the corpus of that can be found generally on our website, coincenter.org, because we're a nonprofit and all our interfacing with regulators and our advocacy materials we put out to the public. So that brings me to what the heck is Coin Center. We didn't pick the name, by the way. It's a kind of a dated name in the cryptocurrency space, back when everything either had bit or block or coin in it. One of our early donors insisted that we call it Coin Center, so we were kind of stuck with it. If we'd had our way, it might have been something like the Institute for Blockchain Studies, but that's IBS, which reminds people of gastrointestinal distress, so that might not have been better anyway. Maybe you shouldn't let sort of more academic sorts name things. Coin Center is a nonprofit that's based in Washington, D.C. We've been around for almost exactly 5 years now, and we've got 3 full-time attorneys on staff, and we've got support staff. And so that's actually a lot of people to be working in DC on something as specific as cryptocurrency policy. What we seek to be is rather like what the Electronic Frontier Foundation was to the early internet and continues to be to the internet. You guys, show of hands if you're familiar with the EFF. It seems perfunctory to ask in Berkeley. But so what the EFF did was they provided a voice to the aspirations of technologists and people who use the internet who wanted either defense in legal situations or a voice in Washington, D.C. to determine how policy around the internet was built out. it's a different voice than, say, Google's opinion or Apple's opinion about the internet. Quite often they're actually matched pretty well, because often what Google wants is what the EFF wants. But obviously there are places where that match can turn into a mismatch. And so it's good that there's an organization looking out just for the internet rather than any corporation using the internet and their interests, to keep it free and open for everyone to use. So if the EFF is that to the internet, we have aspired over our last 5 years to be that to open blockchain networks. And by open blockchain networks, we basically mean anything that has a permissionless consensus mechanism. If it's proof of work, proof of stake, if you can join the network and play a meaningful role validating the blockchain with nothing more than free software and commodity hardware, that's what we take as our constituency, effectively. And we just want to be a voice in DC that explains these technologies to people in Congress, that explains these technologies to people in the regulatory agencies, and that just generally works towards good policy.
So again, how are you funded?
Oh, it's the magic. No, we're funded by generous donations from people in the space. About half of our funding until this most recent year came from individuals.
These are anonymous individuals?
Some of them are not anonymous. One of them is Alex Morkos, who was he's a Bitcoin Core developer. There's several, and the other half comes from companies building in the space. But they don't get a seat at the table. You have to take my word for it. They don't get a say in our agenda. We set our mission, which is to defend the freedom to innovate using these technologies, and they see our work, and if they want to support us, they continue to support us. And that's what we do. Pretty self-explanatory. And a big part of this is briefings and testimony before Congress. And that's my segue into this first topic, which is the case for electronic cash. Because last February, we decided we wanted to do a briefing for congressional staff in the House of Representatives that was curious about the technology. Here's a short video of that demo.
It says, OK, it's 9 cents. I'm going to hit pay. There it goes.
You have no idea how relieved I am. So it's not the most exciting demo. I've always joked with, I have a friend that actually works in drone policy, and he gets to take staffers out and show them like an awesome drone and let the staffer pilot it. Much more fun than a candy machine. But at the same time, it's a demo. And for a long time, we had no demos. It was if you wanted to explain cryptocurrency to a member of Congress, you'd open up a laptop in front of them and say, hey, look at this. It looks just like online banking, but I swear the stuff going on behind the website is way cooler. Just trust me. And so actually having like a physical object in a room and doing a payment from one device to another, for us was a step in the right direction of making this more real and more tangible. Specifically, this transaction, I think, is important to look at because what's going on here is we're using the Lightning Network in this case. But we've done demos with Ethereum. We've done demos with just regular old Bitcoin transactions. But what's happening here is Jerry, my boss, has a phone that has a Lightning-enabled wallet in it that's already funded with a certain amount of Bitcoin. And this candy machine, which I'll tell a little bit more about in the next few slides, also has a Lightning-enabled wallet. And so when Jerry pays the candy machine through the QR code that's displayed on the screen, it's really a peer-to-peer transaction. Money is going straight from where it was, fully in Jerry's control on his phone, to where it now is for the candy, right on the candy machine. And at no point in this person-to-person transaction is there an intermediary in the middle who you have to trust. At least that's the premise of these protocols. There's no one who necessarily can walk away with the funds.
Sorry, to an end user, how does this look any different from Apple Pay or something like that?
That's right, it doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't, and that's a limitation because it's also going to be harder than Apple Pay. And so hopefully the next few slides will help you understand why we're excited about this, which would not be very exciting, and how we basically make those policy arguments why this is technology worth allowing to continue to flourish. The point is it works like cash. So Apple Pay seems like it works like cash. You're there and someone wanted to be paid and you just put your credit card down and the NFC chip in it talks to the point of sale device. But really, we know that that's not cash at all. An Apple Pay transaction, whether it's a Apple credit card or whether it's whatever, is intermediated. There's usually several intermediaries involved. And if it's a credit card transaction, it's not even settlement. It's just a pull authorization. It's just basically me giving permission to the merchant to then go pull funds out of my bank account, and that settlement will happen later. But of course, it's not exactly like cash. It's electronic cash. It's digital cash, because we're actually doing it with a phone paying a computer. In this case, the Arduino that's inside the candy machine. And that's pretty revolutionary because there's no other form of cash that works remotely. You know, a cash transaction always has to happen person to person.
It's weaker than cash as well.
Explain weaker.
If I give you $100 and we both go to sleep for 100 years, we come back, you can use it. I'm not sure that's true with Lightning.
Interesting. I guess there's institutions around all money, right? So it's important not to oversell these things. And there are institutions of people running Lightning nodes or not running Lightning nodes. And there are institutions of banks and the Federal Reserve. And yes.
It's about closing Lightning channels. Yeah.
About settling it out. Yeah.
Anyway.
No, sure. And so what we want to explain with this kind of a demo is that while imperfect, because these technologies are still new and still being refined, this simple transaction tells us some important things about these three topics. They tell us important things about innovation and interoperability, about efficiency and scale within an economy, and the big one, which will be most of this first part of the presentation, tells us some things about privacy and autonomy. So innovation and interoperability. This will be probably a very familiar argument to anyone who's read about cryptocurrency, who's been interested in cryptocurrency or open blockchain networks. It's the story of basically we're going to do to trusted financial institutions what the internet did to trusted lines of communication or intermediaries in communication. So in the old world, we had a select few ways of getting a message across the world. It could be broadcast as television or radio. It could be put into newspapers. And what was revolutionary about TCP/IP as a protocol is that it basically removed any necessary middleman. There's several different ISPs. You just need to have competency in writing for the protocol, and then you can send a message through the protocol. And it also made the type of communication you're choosing to send irrelevant. You're just sending bits. So if you want to use the airwaves, you have to do it in the form of a TV program. You can't send a website over the television broadcasting. If you want to write an article, it has to be in the format of a typical newspaper article. Whereas with TCP/IP, of course, as a sort of purpose-agnostic lower-level protocol, you can build SMTP on top of it, and you can send basically messages that resolve to something more like mail. Or you can build the web on top of it and have interactive websites. Or without permission, you could start sort of building something on top of TCP/IP like VoIP and have voice over the internet. And that's now how, of course, all phones work. Or if you want to build hardware that interacts with this protocol for any particular set of unique and idiosyncratic purposes, like Steve Jobs when he had the vision of the iPhone, you don't need permission to build that. You just need to make it compatible with TCP/IP. Similarly with anything that people then want to build on top of that hardware, like apps on phones and things like that. And so this evolution in how we communicate is, I think, pretty widely and reasonably regarded as sort of the dynamism of the 90s and 2000s in the tech economy. This was a good revolution, generally speaking. We're starting to see aftershocks of it that maybe we don't like so much, but the internet was a force for job growth, was a force for innovation. And so with open blockchain networks, what we say is that we want to take the remaining centralized systems out there and create free and open peer-to-peer alternatives. So here's another set of sort of legacy businesses, and they do things more with payments and with trusted ledgers and data structures, if you will. How can we turn their backends into basically another free and open protocol that people can just build things on top of rather than having to go through any one of these particular providers? And so Bitcoin is one. Ether is another. There are several. And Bitcoin itself is an open protocol which is why people were able to design the Lightning Network as a second layer protocol on top of Bitcoin, even though they weren't the original Bitcoin developers. Some of them might have been, some of them weren't. They didn't need permission to build this, and Bitcoin, no one needed permission to build Bitcoin. That's just software that some strange person released in 2008, 2009. And our candy machine is one example of something you can just, without permission, build on top of the Lightning Network. And this is the person who built it. This is David Nezik. He's a strange guy who lives in Switzerland who started posting on Twitter pictures of what he was building one day. And we found him on Twitter and reached out to him and said, hey, David, that's awesome. You're building a Lightning Network-enabled candy machine. Could we have one to show Congress? And he was immediately, yes, absolutely. We said, we'll pay you. It was like, no, here, it's a gift. It was kind of awkward for him because he was traveling to the US and he was going to New York, not DC. So there was like a weird Lightning-enabled candy machine handoff that happened in New York. And then one of us had to go up and get it. It was a little weird, but it happened. We got it. And what's cool about this story is David didn't have to get, permission to build this thing. He didn't have to open an account with a bank in order to make it payment enabled. He doesn't need to have a merchant account with a credit card issuer. All he has to do is use the open spec of the Lightning Network protocol software and put it in the right way onto commodity hardware. It was an Arduino and some other circuit boards that he got off of Amazon. And then he matched it with one of these, it's usually like a press the button and the candy comes out. He just rewired it, so now if it gets a signal from the Arduino that the Lightning wallet has been paid, give the candy. So permissionless innovation. Is this, is this a real sign of progress? It's a little silly. It's a candy machine, but there's all kinds of things that we might want to have payment enabled. And maybe it would be great if you could payment enable something without having to go through one of several banks or one of several intermediaries. For example, Wi-Fi routers. It'd be great if those things were payment enabled so we could do microtransactions. So when we move from one Wi-Fi hotspot to another, the handoff is seamless, et cetera, et cetera. So efficiency and scale. What does this little transaction as a demo tell us about efficiency and scale? Well, traditional payments are still fundamentally analog. Any particular bank or financial institution might have internal processes that are digital. I mean, they're going to keep track of their accounts probably on a computer, I'd wager. But when you want to pay somebody who doesn't have the same bank as you, which is most of the time for most of us, the processes of settling accounts between multiple financial institutions are still regrettably very analog. And there usually are going to be multiple institutions in between. So even when you make a credit card transaction, this still happens in the back end, whether it's ACH or SWIFT or FedWire or any of these several payment protocols that exist in the legacy financial system. Accounts need to be reconciled between at least two financial institutions, the person paying and the person being paid, and probably intermediary financial institutions like the correspondent banking system. And this takes, of course, 3, maybe 2 now, business days. There's some pushes at the Fed and in the UK towards faster real-time gross settlement, things like that. But it's still very slow, despite the fact that we've, for a long time now, been able to send text messages instantaneously. And so this is nothing revolutionary to you guys because you've been talking the whole week about consensus and state replication, but let's just take these siloed data structures and turn them into one single data structure. Let's share it amongst all the participants on a particular network, and let's have them reach a process of agreement in order to add new transactions to the ledger. That's better, right, in theory, than several siloed databases at different financial institutions in order to do payments. And the Lightning Network is a protocol built on top of Bitcoin to allow Bitcoin, which natively only enables about 7 transactions per second because of the cap on the block size, to possibly have many more transactions per second, potentially millions of transactions per second, with almost no fees. And so this transaction we made where we paid the candy machine, it's important to point out that we had to load the Lightning wallet, which was a normal Bitcoin transaction. And if the Lightning candy machine ever needed to dispose of its funds to someone off the Lightning Network, they'd have to close the channel and pay someone else. But just the actual transaction between the already loaded Lightning wallet and the candy machine, this was the fee that our Lightning wallet recommended we pay in order to make the transaction go through. The transaction was a 0.09 or 0.9 cent transaction per candy, which we chose as a number because it's fun, because you can't even make that payment using physical cash unless you're going to divide pennies up into tenths. So to put that into scale, that's 1/250th of a penny, which means you could have 250 payments to the candy machine and still only pay a cent in fees, at least as the Lightning Network was functioning that day.
Wouldn't you say that this is about digital and analog payments, and not very much about, I guess, decentralization and consensus rate? Because wouldn't the most efficient system be the Fed runs this database and has one, people can maybe check that transactions are valid, but you have one central version?
Absolutely. And that's next. So remember, I said the thing that makes legacy payments inefficient is the part where you want to pay someone who has a different financial institution than you, which is most of the people most of the time. But there are parts of the world where, almost like if the Fed was doing all payments in the US, almost all of the population has the same financial institution or financial enabled app as almost everyone else in the local region. So I'm picking on Shanghai. Almost everyone in Shanghai now has Alipay on their phones. And almost everyone in Shanghai also now has WeChat on their phones, which does payments. And that means that almost everyone in Shanghai, which is a good deal of people, can pay almost anybody. And it only goes through one of these two centralized intermediaries. So of course, efficiency-wise, you can't beat this. This is one database that they control and two numbers being changed on it. It's costless. Or is it costless? And sort of this is the big question. Are there hidden costs? Are there societal costs that we would want to worry about, especially if we were in the business of making policy? And I think yes. And these are costs measured in loss of privacy or loss of personal autonomy. So if you've been to China lately, you've noticed that people are using WeChat and Alipay for almost all transactions. This is somebody paying for lunch. This is a fruit stand. You can buy coconuts using WeChat. This is somebody who's performing. They're a musician, and they're getting tips on, I think that's Alipay. It's not a protest, almost by definition. This is the place where the picture was taken. This is a bicycle you can rent using WeChat or Alipay. This is someone paying for medical services. You're getting the point at this point. This is a library where you can check out books from a robot and pay without dealing with people, just using Alipay or WeChat. And so the problem with this, in my opinion, is that this means that Alipay always knows where you are, what you read, if you're sick, and so does the Chinese government. And this is not me being conspiratorial. This is not me being jingoistically American and anti-Chinese. This is just published fact. Alipay has been very clear, and so is WeChat, that they're happy to share any and all of their payments information with the Communist Party of China. And the Chinese government has been very clear with what they intend to do with this now mountain of payments data. They want to rate all their citizens. They want to give them a social credit score, which is kind of like a credit score, but would also basically make judgments about what you've bought, what transactions you've engaged in, whether you paid your taxes, all these other things, not just your likelihood to repay your mortgage or whatever. And there's no opt-out option. This is from a LA Times article. And they're right, there's no opt-out option, because if you want to pay somebody in China, you're going to use these services, and they're going to share your data, and the data will go into your score. And you might say, well, you could use cash, physical cash. But physical cash is disappearing in China. If you pay using local Chinese currency, you'll often be identified as an outsider, which is kind of ironic because it's Chinese currency, but you'll be identified as an outsider for using paper money rather than these systems that seem so efficient and so easy. And this is from the Alipay technical director. They basically were explaining, how are you going to make these judgments about social credit score? They said someone who plays video games all the time is probably idle. Someone who's buying diapers is probably responsible. So maybe they'll have a higher score. I don't know.
Don't you think that the argument, technically, we could have anonymized, centralized payments and whatever, right? I think we could technically, like, Alipay wouldn't have to know who was paying who. The thing is that
I think you're right. I don't know if China would let them operate in their jurisdiction.
But also, like, don't you think that the bigger problem, also in terms of efficiency, is that, like, naturally a centralized person is a monopolist, so they're just going to do whatever, you know, at some point they're irremovable.
Yeah.
And they're just going to do whatever they want. And even in terms of fees, right, like Visa charges 3% because they would be stupid if they didn't. Right, like they have a monopoly on or basically a monopoly.
70% Visa, yeah, of all credit card transactions.
Of course, they can be more efficient, but I guess I feel like the point of, or one of the big things about decentralization is not that it's not more efficient inherently. Of course, a centralized service is more inherently, but it like sort of separates the control and separates the monopoly structure.
I think that's right. And you know, if you're balking at my sort of government skepticism, which is a more libertarian concern, I completely agree. I mean, that's just one concern. Another one is a more traditionally liberal or progressive concern, which is we should also be skeptical of the large corporations and what they choose to do with the data, whether or not they share it with government, or whether they choose to keep it private, but basically use their monopoly power to extract rents from people who pay. My point isn't so much that the Chinese government is evil. I don't think it is, or that Alipay or WeChat are evil or good. I'm not sure. Well, the Chinese government has done some things that I do think are probably evil, actually. So let me walk that back. Primarily to do with the Uyghurs in the West, and probably several things that I'm completely unaware of. But my point is that there's a weakness in these payment systems. And it's not a weakness about efficiency, just like you said, because actually this is the most efficient way to do payments, by far. It's a weakness measured in giving up your autonomy and your privacy to someone in the middle who's got a lot of power over you as a human being. And so what happens if your social credit score goes too low? Slower internet speeds. This wasn't speculation either. This was also from sources within the Chinese government or within the companies. Restricted access to restaurants, nightclubs, golf courses, the removal of the right to travel freely abroad. And already in China, over 1 million people have lost the so-called privilege of taking high-speed rail or traveling on planes, either domestically or internationally. That's a lot of people.
Where do you get this information? I don't think this is correct.
I can give you a source for the ban on high-speed rail travel for over 1 million people.
Okay, okay, maybe we can talk about
Yeah.
after. I don't think it's true.
It's over 1 million, at least as reported by, I can't remember which Human Rights Watch organization it was. They might be a biased source, I don't know. And so this is another aspect of this. Less to do with privacy, more to do with autonomy. If there's one company in the middle, they can also enforce sanctions against the population. So if your score falls too low, a good way to enforce that sort of guilt, if having a low score is actually guilt, would be to go to Alipay or WeChat as a corporation and say, you should stop processing transactions for this person. And we see this. We see this in a more benign way in the US. If you, there was somebody who put thanks for the Cuban sandwich in the memo field of their Venmo payment, and their account was locked temporarily, because Cuba is on the sanctions list. This is a silly example, but this happens all the time. Suddenly you can't use your account because there's questions of fraud or impropriety or violation of laws. There's nothing you can do about it. You have to go to the payment provider and tell them to unlock your account. And as I said, if physical cash is disappearing, as it really is, having your financial accounts locked really does mean you just can't participate in economic life until they get unlocked.
Could you imagine cases where there was a reasonable national security reason to lock somebody's account? Or you think that everybody should have unlocked accounts? Right?
So I can imagine lots of cases where there's a reasonable national security rationale for breaking encryption. Now, does that mean we should?
That was not a yes, no to my answer.
I know. I'm just trying to be a little provocative in that, you know, we build these systems, and then the vulnerabilities that they have or the nature of their architecture can either be exploited for good or for bad. And there's always good reasons to exploit sort of weaknesses in their technical architecture, as long as the government doing that exploitation is doing the right thing. I guess my point is we should be building systems that just don't have those weaknesses. But that's a larger metaphysical and philosophical conversation about what you worry about in the world. Do you worry about the abuse of centralized power, or do you worry about anarchy?
But beyond personal opinions, there are also laws, right? Both national and international, about which kind of financial transactions are sanctioned by law and which
Absolutely.
aren't. AML.
But those laws don't agree.
Don't agree across nations.
No. So, like, if we build a payment protocol, should it be compliant with the Chinese dictates as to who should be paid, or with the European dictates, which have now started to diverge strongly from the American dictates because they want to trade with Iran and we want to just keep sanctioning Iran? Whose laws?
But anyway, if we are talking about the global thing, we had the currency that depends on finite resource, which was the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
And we got away from the gold standard because it doesn't let us increase and decrease the amount of money. It doesn't allow the Fed to be.
Stimulus, yeah.
So are we envisioning the Fed going out and letting Bitcoin control the economy? What is...
No, and see, our organization, I mean, there are plenty of people who would love that. I'm not one of them. I just want there to be censorship-resistant and private payment protocols. And then, are they going to replace national currencies? No, I don't think so. I just think that's, at least not anytime soon. And yeah, you're right, if they did and if they were commodity-based or, you know, like gold or Bitcoin, there would be macroeconomic implications. We'd finally have a good laboratory to find out whether Keynes was right, or whether, you know, the more classical economists were right about, you know, how you stimulate the economy and you know, what is inflation and all that. But that's a whole other topic, I think. I just think there should be a payment rail that doesn't go through Barclays by necessity.
There has to be some aspects to it. I mean,
That's the EU, for example.
there's a difference between paying for candy and sending $3 trillion in cash, right? So there's, or in your view, there's no difference between paying for candy and moving $3 trillion.
Well, there's obviously a difference. And then I guess the question is, we need to talk about how we design...
By the same rights and the same ability to transfer things,
Right.
the same control.
So how do you build a protocol that discriminates? And who gets to choose, right?
I get to ask you.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've moved quickly into the realm of sort of deep philosophical prejudices, and that's fun. But I think this is just worth sharing. This might not be, this has all kinds of problems, because yeah, you could fund a terrorist attack using Bitcoin.
You might want to say that if you want to buy candy, you can never be unlocked, but if you want to move $3 trillion,
Yeah.
maybe this is fine.
I think that's an interesting way to do that sort of discrimination. And to argue against myself earlier when I made maybe the false equivalency to encryption, there's no way to judge what the plain text is from the ciphertext. So there wouldn't be a way to mechanically or mechanistically only enforce the decryption that we want, you know? But maybe we could actually force the censorship or non-privacy of certain payments that we think are just too big. It is possible, whereas the encryption stuff would not be possible. It's a good point.
I think more generally, there's this question of governance, right? So if you have a system, any system you're envisioning, there will be these cases, as many cases you have to deal with, which means you probably don't want the one-size-fits-all sort of guarantee, you know, that your account will never be locked. You want there to be some mechanism by which some governing body, in some form,
Yes. This does though get into the question of key escrow with encryption. You know, yeah.
And I think that's a profound question.
It is.
That as you know, the work we do actually touches society that we have no choice but to face, which is the question of governance.
I think that's absolutely right. And you know, our point is that this debate isn't being had to the fullest, because everyone seems to think that Bitcoin is the revolution that's changing the world, when in reality, the networked financial system is the revolution that changed the world. So 100 years ago, no one knows who you pay. there's no records of that. You go to the bank occasionally and you take out cash, and then all your day-to-day transactions are made using cash, which leaves no record, unlike Bitcoin, which actually has an auditable record. And then suddenly everything is being done using bank cards and now apps on phones, and now there is a massive amalgamation of data. And right now it's all poorly secured and basically public. I mean, there are efforts to keep it private within financial institutions, and they get hacked all the time, and these systems are bad. And we could, as was suggested, maybe push centralized payment processors to be better with privacy, or we can talk about building peer-to-peer alternatives. Yeah. But that debate's not being had because I think everyone thinks that the world we're in now is somehow not very novel, when in reality it's radically different. This use of WeChat and Alipay in China is an incredible tool for totalitarians. It's also an incredible tool for people. It's great, but it's also a liability. I think that's the point that we want to get across.
Can I just ask, sorry,
Yep.
I'm probably jumping ahead of it.
No, please.
I guess the question I asked earlier about, how is this different for the end user is ultimately WeChat is an app on a phone in the same way that whatever someone was using there is an app that they downloaded on their phone that interfaces with Lightning. So, I mean, to some extent, centralization is a natural phenomenon. We've seen it happen with every decentralized technology that's been deployed. We've seen it happen with cryptocurrencies. So, I mean, these systems, it's good, obviously, to move towards decentralization and build on these decentralized backends, but the interfaces into them will become and are centralized, right? And so...
You mean because,
like apps?
We used, I forget the name of the Lightning Wow app we used, because it auto-updates on an Android or an iOS device, and they can sort of sneak stuff into the code that...
There's just a set of developers who made it, right? Ultimately, there's a set of developers who make Ethereum, right? And it seems like, at the moment, it's nice to say, oh, but they're not a monopoly, so if you don't like the decision they're making, then you do something else. But then it seems like the solution in the decentralized world is just like infinite segmentation, right? So I don't like Ethereum, I'm going to hard fork, and now I have Ethereum Classic, and then I don't like this latest decision by the developers, so now I'm going to make my new thing. And we're in this economy where everything becomes worth something somehow, but it's infinite hard forking doesn't seem like a good answer either.
Yeah, I don't think that's the only answer here. I think it would be an oversimplification of these new technologies to say that because there's a handful of developers that write the code, they're part and parcel the same as basically JP Morgan's back end. The big difference is being that we don't even know what JP Morgan's back end is because it's proprietary. And it's proprietary both in the sense that the code that they run on their several servers around the world is not open source. It's not published to the public. Nobody knows, what it is. It's a trade secret. So it might have weaknesses that we don't know. It might do things we don't know. And the right to participate in maintaining that backend is one that is fully controlled by JP Morgan. So contrast that with Bitcoin, where there's code that runs it. It's been written by the 600 contributors or so to the GitHub repository, but we all know that really it's probably about 15 individuals that did the bulk of the coding. But it's all open source. It's MIT licensed. I think it's MIT. There's repositories apart from GitHub that have copies of it. And so its full history and how it's evolved and how it's changed is there for anybody who's technologically facile to audit. And then in order to use the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network and actually play a role in validating the blockchain, you need just a computer and the open source code. Now, in order to play a role adding blocks to the blockchain, you're going to need a data center full of commodity hardware that you can buy. But in order to actually just validate every digital signature for every transaction going back to 2009, you just need actually a pretty ordinary high-powered home computer. Digital signatures are not computationally intensive to verify. The blockchain is still measured in gigabytes. It's not too big yet. It'll get big. But we can do, pruning and things like that potentially. Anyway, I think there's a fundamental difference there. Is it a silver bullet? Does it mean that somehow Bitcoin is decentralized in the way that actual commodity money is decentralized, like gold. Like you really don't have to trust somebody if you can do an assay of gold. I guess you do have to trust somebody if you do an assay of gold. Anyway, this is getting pretty metaphysical again. And I do think there is a fundamental difference. Is it going to solve all the world's problems? No. But is it a technology worth allowing to continue? Which is always the sort of looming question that we're responding to. Because we interface with folks in DC, several of whom would just as soon ban this stuff rather than allow people to continue writing the code.
So it seems like the main distinction you made was that the code is open source.
Oh, and the consensus mechanism for keeping the blockchain. If it's not convincing to you, that's okay. This is the amount of cash that's still in a lot of Western economies. Some, and actually just global economies. Some countries still very much value cash, and there's a lot of it in circulation as percentage of their GDP. In some countries like Sweden, as the most extreme example, people are born and raised and don't know what their local hard currency looks like. They couldn't identify it, actually, because they use apps all the time to pay for everything, which means they are at the whim of whoever's providing that app or that credit card for their privacy and their autonomy, if you will, with respect to payments. And this is a larger point that I think doesn't get discussed enough in legal communities. Punishing people by going through private intermediaries to force them to censor payments for certain users, I don't think it can be easily reconciled with the rule of law. So the rule of law in our legal tradition is that there's no punishment without there first having been a law that was described, and then you have to be found guilty of that criminal statute, and then there can be punishment. And the fact of the matter is, at least as we've seen it thus far, when payments censorship is used to affect policy, it's done extra legally. It's done outside of the rule of law. WikiLeaks is an extremely controversial nonprofit, and it doesn't matter if you love them or hate them at this point. The story I want to tell goes back to when Chelsea Manning leaked the DOJ cables.
Can we go back to,
To
this,
Paul here.
yeah. Do you consider sanctions, like international sanctions?
Yeah.
Also?
Sanctions probably don't fit in a classical comprehension of the rule of law. Maybe. That'd be a really good law review article. I'm not going to write it, and I'm not going to go take on sanctions policy. But the question is to whether you can tell your whole population that they're simply not allowed to financially interact with somebody in another population ever, full stop. It is still a law. It's a law, and there's a list that's published, and you wouldn't get in trouble if, would you get in trouble if you paid someone who wasn't on the list but was in a sanctioned country? It's an interesting question.
Trouble if you're in one country and you have a war in a different country and you're sending money funding this other country, would you get in trouble? I mean, this is kind of when national security gets kind of an argument here, then I don't understand how you could say it's not a law.
I mean, this might get a little philosophical, but when it comes to international law, we have war regulated, war conduct regulated,
Hopefully.
Hopefully it's enforced or abided by. But I'm saying there are really, really bad things that are essentially
Still law.
Still law.
Yeah, and I mean, if this is interesting to you, I can recommend a rich canon of literature about the nature of the rule of law and whether it is essentially a positivist construction, this is what H.L.A. Hart argued, or whether it has some normative features to it that make it somehow better, whether there's a morality baked into using the law to do policy. And H.L.A. Hart basically said, say what you will about the Nazis. That's basically a summary of what H.L.A. Hart said. But they still did a lot of what they did through law. And the only difference was what the ends of those laws were. Otherwise, they're not that different than British law. And he was arguing with a guy named Lon Fuller, who wrote a really fascinating book called The Inner Morality of Law, who said, first of all, you're wrong empirically. The Nazis actually, they used arbitrary power all the time. They did not do things through law. And what do I mean by law? This is me channeling Lon Fuller. Well, there's these 7 principles that I call the inner morality of law. And these are things like the law should be clear and comprehensible. It shouldn't be, impossible to interpret. It should be announced in advance of any punishment of the law. And there's several others. It should be general, so there shouldn't be laws that say, like, everyone can do this except Peter. That's not a good law. It's great literature, but it's kind of beyond the talk.
We have a bunch of Israelis here, so you mentioned Nazis. You opened the floodgates.
I'm sorry. I brought us to Gödel's rule.
Imagine
or not,
if you were living
Goodwin's.
in the UK during World War II, and Bitcoin existed. You'd think that it's fine for you to send Bitcoin payments to the Nazi German institution.
No, I think
Steer away from.
No, and we don't even have to do that. Do I think that somebody should? Is it okay for someone to pay Kim? Is it someone okay? Is it? Let me bring this more recent and not related to Hitler. Is it okay for someone today to pay Kim Jong-un? Is it okay for someone in New Jersey to pay Kim Jong-un? I'd say no, it's not okay. They should be probably arrested.
So I think that goes back to Dalia's question.
But should you build a technology that stops them before they even had a chance? Or do you just find them and punish them for doing something you think is wrong? That's part of the question.
Oh, no, I think the law is pretty clear about who's liable and who's responsible there. If you build the technology that interprets, gives all the means of interpretation, you are liable. But I think the fundamental point here, and again steering away from very, very sensitive things like World War II, is that when you're in the cryptocurrency space, talking about what governments do within their own nation is pretty limited, and really by nature this has international context. And international law is a very, very, very different thing when it comes to values or what you think is. So first of all, there's no constitution.
Yeah, it's
maybe the Geneva Conventions.
Right, which is going to be silent on this kind of
stuff.
stuff.
The values are very, very different.
Oh yeah. And it's just a pluralistic.
And so sanctions and traffic rules.
Yeah. So the law of European nations doesn't agree with the law of America. Asia doesn't agree. And so it's actually an anarchy. It's Hobbes, if you will. There's no single sovereign. And so it sort of collapses into a mess. I mean, I'd like to have faith in international law to resolve hard questions, but it's really just a mess.
We should have international UN. Yeah, international money UN.
Have the UN as a central banker.
It's great.
It's an idea. It's an idea. Anyway, so my only thing about WikiLeaks was this. Whether you hate them or don't mind them, I don't know if anyone likes them anymore. That's fair. When Chelsea Manning leaked the Department of Defense cables to WikiLeaks, which revealed a lot of our practices in Afghanistan and around the world that she thought were worth leaking, immediately you were unable to donate to WikiLeaks, which was a registered nonprofit in the UK, by credit card. You couldn't use Visa, MasterCard, American Express. You couldn't use any of those credit cards to make a donation to WikiLeaks anymore. And this wasn't because we had the Congress in the US pass a law that says that you can't donate to WikiLeaks, which probably wouldn't even be a constitutional law because we have First Amendment protections of our right to support nonprofits that further a cause that we think is just. But there wasn't even an attempt to pass such a law. It's basically some powerful people within the US government talked to powerful people within American Express, Visa, and MasterCard and said, if you're a patriot, you'll stop processing these transactions. And they did. So extra legal. Extra legal is also dangerous even if you believe that there's generally benign leaders, that the government isn't trying to do anything wrong, because it doesn't go through a regularized process that has sort of oversight. It could be algorithmic. Like I said, if you put Cuban sandwich in your Venmo transaction, your account might be locked they'll unlock it later, but these things happen algorithmically and automatically. This is a woman in China who's being publicly shamed for jaywalking. Her face is being put up on this big billboard in a big city because they have these facial recognition cameras on the crosswalks. And if your face appears in the crosswalk when it says don't walk, your face goes up here, and then you're recorded in a database as a jaywalker. The problem is this woman is not jaywalking. She appeared as an advertisement on the side of a bus, and the bus is repeatedly in the crosswalk when it says don't walk. Now, this is all fun and fine, and they apologized, and it all ended up okay. It didn't end up on our permanent record. But the fact of the matter is a lot of things can go wrong when you rely on these sort of algorithmic enforcement procedures, and when the punishment could be something like, oh, well, suddenly I can't engage in economic life anymore because my apps are all locked.
Do you know who he is? Who she is?
From what I understand, she's the CEO of this company.
It's actually also one of the biggest electronic appliance manufacturers in China.
Oh, fantastic. So she probably had no problem getting that erased from her record. Your average person's not on a bus either, so whatever. And this is another one that just, I think, is alarming and shows the power of the data that people are collecting as financial intermediaries. This was a sort of fun beta plugin for WeChat that you could install if you wanted. And what it would do is show you a Google Maps style map of your locality and put little people on that map who owe a lot of money. I don't know what they want people to do with this information. You just walk around and oh, not gonna, buy or sell from you, or maybe I'll shun you. I don't know. It's just it's very alarming. And so my point is not an absolutist point. It's just that only digital cash systems like Bitcoin and Ethereum preserve a free and open alternative that can't be taken away by even the most corrupt government or unscrupulous corporation. And so if you think that on balance most people will use these systems for good and we can tolerate the evil that people will use these systems for, then it's good that there's this escape valve. It's good that there's a system that can't be destroyed by a corrupt government, to shut down the Hong Kong protests or what have you. It's good that there's a system that exists even if the banks want to charge monopoly rents over all financial transactions because they've achieved some sort of market power.
So I don't think the system can be shut down. Bitcoin can be shut down by one particular corrupt government, but they can certainly take away your rights to use the technology, right?
That's absolutely true, yeah.
So
we don't have tech that solves that yet. I think...
So the system can be taken away, but as far as you're concerned, the system is taken away.
So maybe we should just say instead of can't be taken away, there it is, increases the costs of taking it away pretty radically. I mean, even the idea of, say, China shutting down the Bitcoin network by, seizing the ASIC foundries where all the chips are made and then plugging them in and then not putting transactions in blocks anymore would be incredibly expensive, even for China. But they could do it. Yeah, they could do it. And then what would we do? We'd just use Ethereum, or we'd use some other one. So it'd be a whack-a-mole game that's incredibly costly very quickly.
I mean, what if an app store just takes away all apps that provide an interface into a cryptocurrency?
Go Linux. Go open source apps. Screw the Play Store. Screw the iOS, app store.
What percentage of people are you talking about at that point?
Not many, but maybe some human rights activists who use Tor, who use PGP.
Okay.
And some criminals, to be totally honest, of course.
It's worth noting they could also just change the proof of work type away from SHA-256.
Right, and then you've bought all these ASICs that do diddly squat now. Congrats, you've got a giant pile of silicon that's useless. And in fact, the easiest way for China to attack Bitcoin was probably, from what I understand, be a DDoS attack on the peer-to-peer network, just to stop messages from moving around, rather than actually trying to do a 51% attack. Similar results. I'm not a sysadmin or a highly technical person, so I don't know. But that sounds right to me. Let's see, how much do I have left of this? Okay, one thing that no one has brought up, but maybe it's because it was just obvious, is that Bitcoin's actually really terrible for privacy. It's like awful. It's a great tool for a totalitarian government because, yeah, all the transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain look random-ish to us. They're one address paid another, and they go all the way back to 2009. But as we know well, if you can afford to pay Chainalysis or some other big data aggregator that matches Bitcoin addresses with real identities through clustering analysis and things like that, you can basically use the Bitcoin blockchain to de-anonymize any payment and to know everything about the payment. And this is how we did things like catch Ross Ulbricht, the guy who was running the Silk Road. And this is how we also found out that there were 2 corrupt government agents in that investigation who were taking kickbacks from Ross Ulbricht to not turn him in, because the kickbacks were paid using Bitcoin on the blockchain, actually, which is pretty funny. So those are good examples, I guess, if you don't think that there should be online drug markets. Those are good examples of Bitcoin being too public. Great, we were able to stop Silk Road. But there are also plenty of bad examples. It'd be basically like if Bank of America just decided to put a big billboard up in Times Square, and every time you transact, have a number that represents you and a number that represents the person you're paying, and just like that's free for everyone to see. It's not a good way, probably, to do privacy. So there are new technologies. You guys have talked about ZK snarks and other proofs. There are mixing protocols. There are ring signatures that could be incorporated into these protocols. They could be incorporated into Bitcoin, and there's long been talk of that. Or they could be the basis of new cryptocurrencies like Zcash, Monero. The Mimblewimble protocol is quite interesting. It's being implemented in Beam and Grin. And these will probably lead us to a world where you can have peer-to-peer payments that are validated, so we know there's no double spending, by an open set of participants, whoever mines the blockchain. But none of those participants actually learn who paid who or how much, not even a pseudonym representing those people. And so I think this will work. I think this already works at some small scale. And so these things are coming. And if what you're concerned about is totalitarian governments and a lack of financial privacy, this is good news. If what you're concerned about is crime and terrorism, this might be very bad news. But it's news. I think, personally, free and open payment systems embody liberal values because they're open, because they respect privacy and autonomy. They don't put an arbitrary barrier between you and the person you want to transact with that doesn't necessarily always obey the rule of law, but is usually just there with their own discretion and their own power making choices for you. And so if that's interesting, that's that research report that we published last February. And we do have sources for things like the travel ban in that report. And with that, I think we're at an hour.
Make sure to hydrate and eat something. And